project is meant to infuse humanism with beauty, passion, and dynamism. He believes that society is desperately in need of a living community dedicated to human flourishing and freedom. In addition to his speaking engagements and involvement in other humanist projects, he is also assistant editor at the New Humanist online magazine. Author of Good Without God, Greg Epstein described him as, quote, one of the most important young thinkers in the humanist movement today, and an incredibly eloquent and entertaining speaker. Please help me welcome James Croft.
You're supposed to lower expectations, Scott. You can't use that quote to introduce me now, I won't be able to live up to it. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming on what for me is very early on a Saturday morning. If I were you, I would still be in bed for my own speech. So I really appreciate that you're here. I'd like to begin with a story. You don't believe in God? Are you serious? My incredulous interrogator laughed uproariously, flinging his hands into the air before slapping them down on the table which sat between us, causing the glasses on our canteen trays to ring and our cutlery to jump. So what? You think that all this just sprang up out of nothing, with no reason behind it? I wish now that I had given a more eloquent response than a surprised yes. My eyebrows raised in astonishment. In my defense, though, this was my first encounter with someone who had literally never met a humanist before. Someone who was truly taken aback at the idea that you could live your life without a belief in a God. As you can probably tell from my accent and my exquisite dress sense, I'm not from around here. And when I lived in England, I tended to assume that pretty much everyone was an atheist, unless given reason to believe otherwise. I grew up in a happy atheist family, attending church only so I could sing in the choir, something that I still enjoy and still do. And while I read and learned about the stories in the Bible, I knew very few people who actually seemed to believe in them. Therefore, you can perhaps forgive my inarticulate surprise when confronted with a person who had never met an atheist and who thought the idea of a life without God was ridiculous. Perhaps that also explains why that incident has stuck with me for the past few years. I remember my fellow Harvard graduate student prodding at my beliefs as if I was some strange, exotic alien, asking, if you don't believe in God, where do your morals come from? And isn't your life meaningless without an ultimate purpose? The capital letters in ultimate and purpose were clearly indicated by the portentous manner in which he intoned them. How many of you have had to answer such questions from time to time? Just put your hands up. Yes, most of the people in this room. How many of you have had to answer really insulting questions about where you get your morals from or how you can find meaning and purpose in life? Pretty much all of us, right? If I was someone inclined to take offense at things, it strikes me that these could be seen as extremely offensive questions, suggesting as they do that the only route to a moral life is through religion, and that our non-religious worldview must therefore be ethically deficient and devoid of meaning. After years living in the United States, however, more than 6 years now, it's an amazing thing about that, I am no longer surprised when I hear such sentiments expressed. Instead, horrifyingly, I'm sometimes relieved if the worst someone has to say to me about my worldview is that it must lead to an amoral and meaningless existence. Why? Because since then, I have come face to face with many more egregious and insidious examples of prejudice against humanists, agnostics, and the non-religious. I have heard televangelists shriek that people who are not traditionally religious are responsible for social breakdown, crime, and even natural disasters. I have heard news reporters casually describe non-religious people as de facto supporters of Stalinism and Nazism. I have noted how it seems impossible for a non-believer to be elected to high office in this country, and how public declarations of religious faith are required of those aiming the highest. And in my travels around the country to speak at conferences like this, I've met people like Bill from New Orleans, who attends humanist meetings, but refuses to pose for photographs because they fear, should their atheism be revealed, that he would lose his job. Does anybody know anyone like that? Someone who's unwilling to admit that they're an atheist to family or friends or co-workers? Now, I didn't experience that because I grew up in a non-religious family, but I did struggle for many years with my sexuality before coming out as gay, and so I know how hard it is to keep a part of yourself, a part of your identity, hidden from people, and that's something that no one should have to do. Now, this prejudice against atheists in America isn't just found in workplaces and homes, but it's in politics too. In the last few years, including during the recent presidential election, I'm sure you'll remember, we've heard numerous derogatory remarks directed at atheists by particularly prominent members of the Republican Party. One loathsome individual with the improbable name of Newt Gingrich warned, it's very strange, isn't it, warned that the Democrats were pursuing a secular socialist agenda in keeping with what he called a relentlessly anti-religious bias, to which I can respond, if only they were. He railed against the spectre of America becoming a secular atheist country, before adding, confusingly, potentially one dominated by radical Islamists. It takes a little working through in your mind to imagine how that could possibly be the case. It's important to stress that as much as we might like it to be true, people like Newt Gingrich and others like Rick Santorum and Rick Perry have said things similar, are not fringe figures in the Republican Party, and nor are they on the extremes of American political life. They were considered, if only briefly, serious contenders for their party's nomination for president. So we can conclude from this that anti-atheist sentiment runs rampant at the highest levels of American government, and basically no one is willing to speak out against it. More chillingly, in my 6 years here, and particularly during the years I've traveled as a speaker, I've come face to face with the baleful influence of the religious right on American culture. I've spoken out at rallies against the far right in Massachusetts, as when representatives of the Seven Mountains movement, an extremely right-wing Christian splinter group, were invited to speak at a conference on Harvard's campus. The Seven Mountains movement advocates, and I'm not kidding, sending Elijah revolutionaries and prayer warriors to take over the US government. I have debated in favor of reproductive rights in front of a mainly hostile audience of hundreds in Ohio, while an anti-choice protest was staged outside. And I remember sitting horrified as I watched scores of teenagers jeer and yell at young atheist activist Jessica Hallquist at a meeting at her high school in Rhode Island, and saw tens of people speak out against the principle of secular government. It's clear to me, as an outsider to these shores, that the religious right is one of the most powerful opponents of progress in American culture, holding the country back as an anchor embedded in silt drags on a noble ship which struggles for calmer waters. These experiences, and I use this term conscious of its ironies, have radicalized my humanism. Seeing how non-believers are treated in America and watching the terrible effect of the religious right on American culture and politics encouraged me to begin speaking at conferences like this one. And I spent the last 2.5 years doing just that. In fact, I was looking over my resume in preparation for this talk and realized that since 2011, I have represented humanism and atheism almost 50 times at conferences and other events, speaking to student and local groups, providing an atheist voice on interfaith panels and in interfaith services, and sometimes representing humanism on radio and television. I've gone deep into humanist activism because, well, thank you, yes, it's taken up a lot of my time. I've gone deep into humanist activism because I believe a humanist culture would be a better culture, and that a vibrant humanist movement would be an enormous boon to American public life. I believe that if America is going to become a more reasonable, just, and compassionate society, then much of the work to make that happen will fall on our shoulders. And now, as I train to become an ethical culture leader, Hugh is here, who's a current ethical culture leader. Ethical culture is a movement of humanistic congregations, which has been around for almost 150 years now. I'm preparing to make humanism my career. This is my life. And in my travels around the country to talk humanism, I've learned two things. First, that American humanists and atheists are, in general, wonderful people. It's always good to suck up to your audience, but it's true. People frequently of great courage and integrity. It takes courage to tell your highly religious parents that you no longer believe what they believe and risk being shunned, disowned, or even thrown out of the house like young Damon Fowler was in Louisiana. And it demonstrates integrity to follow your intellect wherever it leads, even if it means giving up cherished beliefs which have sustained you for a lifetime. And in my travels, I have been consistently inspired by the many atheist activists I have met, and particularly the students, like the employees of the Secular Student Alliance, who earn way less than they might in other jobs and work way more than most people, but do so because they love this movement and what it represents. I'm inspired by the young people I have seen blossom into activists, like Harrison Hopkins, who I first met when he was a rather nervous speaker at a Centre for Inquiry conference, and who now works for the Centre for Inquiry, and Max Nielsen, who went from student activist to working with the Secular Coalition for America in what seemed like the blink of an eye. Some of my best friends and fondest memories have emerged from the atheist movement, and I'm exceedingly grateful for that. I love this movement, it's given a lot to me. The second thing I've learned, however, is less positive. And here I'm going to be intentionally rather provocative because I want this weekend to be useful to you and to engage you in a set of questions that I think are critical to the future of our movement. I have learned that the atheist and humanist movement, as currently constituted, is in no position whatsoever to have a major impact on the cultural life of this country. I'll wait a moment for that to sink in. In fact, I think I'll say it again for emphasis. Our movement, with its current strategies and size, is incapable of achieving the sort of cultural and political impact we might wish it would have. Why do I say this? For two main reasons. They're pretty obvious. First, our movement is way too small. And second, our strategies are often very unwise. First, the problem of size. While the number of people considering themselves non-religious is growing surprisingly quickly in America, the number of active members of the atheist and humanist movements is still minute. To be clear, only a fraction of those who call themselves non-religious identify as either atheist or humanist. One comprehensive study of religious belief in America found in a representative sample of roughly 3,100 Americans, only 3 people called themselves atheist or humanist. That's 3 people out of 3,100, not 3%. Other surveys estimate the number of self-described atheists at around 6%, which means that the majority of religious nuns are not atheists. According to the 2012 data from Pew, 2/3 of the non-religious in this country say they believe in God, positively say they believe in God. More than 1/3 identify as spiritual but not religious, and most see value in churches and other religious institutions. And the number of those 6% of atheists, if we're being generous with the figure, who are part of the atheist movement, I mean coming to a conference like this or a member of the American Humanist Association or American Atheists, is even smaller, a tiny fraction of the population. Just to give a sense of scale here, there are single religious congregations in America with larger memberships than some of our national movement organizations. Single congregations. Now, if we want to wield some serious political influence in this country, and I have a confession to make, I want power. I want political and cultural power for humans. That's what I want. And if we want to wield serious political influence, we need to bring massively more people into this movement. I mean, increase the membership of our groups and organizations until they are 10 times larger than they are now. And so finding ways to reach out to the broadly secular but still not engaged masses of non-religious people, the nuns, who do not call themselves atheists, is one of the critical challenges of our movement today. Second, as I've said, I think our strategies are often quite unwise. Now let me be very clear here, because I'm bound to be misunderstood. This will be all over the blogosphere. What I'm about to say is not meant as an attack on any individuals or movement organizations, but rather as friendly criticism, constructive criticism, from someone who studies activism and helps teach activists how to be more effective as part of my career. I'm not interested in getting into a discussion of firebrands versus diplomats and accommodationism versus whatever the other thing is, isn't it? I'm talking cold, hard political strategy informed by social science here. We have reams of data on these points. Many of the times when we make an appeal to the public, we do so in ways that seem calculated to turn people off. When we go out of our way to offend people, even if that excites our most committed base, which I accept it does, it often makes it more difficult to reach out to a new constituency who might be interested in our message were we to present it in a more positive way. And presenting it in a more positive way wouldn't turn off that base who's already engaged, so there's no downside. Those religious nuns we want to reach, we have to remember, have religious co-workers, religious family members, religious spouses, religious friends, and they're kind of meh on the God question. They don't really care about it very much. And if we hit them too hard with the God is not real, religion is a delusion line, they can be easily turned away. And I know countless people in my own experience who have been turned away from participation in this movement because of those sorts of rhetoric. Being needlessly offensive, and note I said needlessly offensive, there is such a thing as needly offensive, makes it more difficult to bring new people into the movement. And as I said, we desperately need new people. So it's a self-defeating strategy. And it certainly makes it more difficult to forge strategic alliances with liberal religious groups, which is something we will desperately need to do, at least until we are much larger as a movement than we are today. So those are the two problems, size and strategy. How can we overcome those problems? Well, I have two suggestions. And luckily, they fit perfectly into the theme of this conference. It's like I kind of work to make it fit somehow. First, we must foster unity around shared humanist values. Second, we have to begin to build real humanist communities to provide people with some of the benefits they currently get from religious congregations. So first, unity. It's easy to say to any movement, and it's a constant cry of activists everywhere, that we must be unified. But unified around what? What should bring us together? I suggest that it must be the basic values of humanism, and that means that the atheist movement must ultimately become a humanist movement. Those basic values being reason, the idea that our problems will be solved through the application of our collective intellect, compassion, the idea that every human being is equal in moral worth and dignity, and hope, the belief that we can, if we work together, make the future better than the past. Those three values I consider foundational and non-negotiable. That means drawing some distinct boundaries. Any creed or ideology which denigrates some group or class of people is ruled out of participation in our movement. Sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. must be unacceptable. Most of us agree with that already. But also we must commit, and this is more difficult, to never demeaning religious people, or people who believe in faith healing or whatever. We must not succumb to Islamophobia or the ridiculous idea and false idea that religious people are stupid or ignorant. They're not, all of them. Many people are thoughtful people. This doesn't mean that we should never offer principled criticism of beliefs and practices which are damaging, but we should always criticize, holding the dignity of the person we are criticizing foremost in our minds. When we criticize, we should do so assertively, with steel, but also compassionately, clothing our steel in luscious velvet. It works, and it's also a surprisingly sensual metaphor for 9:51 on a Saturday morning. Our commitment to human dignity as a movement must be unimpeachable and a basic requirement for anyone who wishes to join us in our struggle. Furthermore, we must ensure that humanist values guide everything that we do. That means not just how we relate to other people who are outside the movement, but also how we treat each other. Now, I write a humanist blog, Temple of the Future, you can look it up if you like, and since joining this movement, I have to say I have frequently been shocked and sometimes horrified by the way our blogosphere heaps vitriol not just on religious people, but sometimes on fellow atheists who dare to voice an unpopular opinion. Sometimes, frankly, I am ashamed to be associated with this movement, despite my love of humanism and despite all the time I've given to it. If we are to find unity, it must be a unity founded on shared values, and those values must shine through in every interaction we have with the public and with each other. I believe that if we treat each other and people who are not part of our movement in a way consistent with humanist principles, we will show the world what we care about by how we act. And that will be much more appealing to newcomers than 100 splashy billboards. By becoming a community which lives out its values, we will lead people by example and lead them to humanism. Second, building community. I believe that one of the reasons religion appeals to people so strongly is because religious congregations offer many things of value to their members. Because we focus so often on the ridiculous nature of many religious beliefs, and they are ridiculous, our movement frequently overlooks that religion as a social phenomenon actually provides people with things they want, sometimes with things that they actually need and that they can't get anywhere else. We all, from time to time, I think, struggle with existential questions. If you're anything like me, you struggle with them all the time. Who am I? What's going on? Why am I here? How can I deal with suffering in my life? Some of the most important questions that we face. And very often people turn to religious communities because they offer a place to work through those questions with other people. People generally want to join communities with others who share their general outlook on life, and congregations offer that opportunity. They're often rich with music and narrative and welcoming friends, all things that I'd like more of myself sometimes. And of course, they provide a mechanism to pass on beliefs and values of one generation to the next. If we humanists want to make a bigger cultural impact, then, I believe we must compete directly with religions by offering congregations of our own. Places where people can go to ask the big questions of life in a skeptical but welcoming context. Places which offer music and stories and art which spread the humanist message. Places where we can use to plan more activism and outreach so that we can have a bigger impact on the world. Imagine how cool it would be if in every major city in this country and town there was a humanist community centre, a godless congregation, open to the public, offering inspirational speeches and educational programs and enriching seminars. That'd be freaking cool, right? While providing local atheists a place to hang out. In fact, we're about to open such a community centre in Boston, the first of its kind in Boston. In a couple of months. And I am so excited about the possibilities. We have a space for kids, we have a conference centre, we have a big lecture room, we have a reception area, we have a little kitchen. It's going to be fucking awesome. I can't wait. And I'm allowed to swear, because in an English accent it just sounds polite. We even just hired Teresa McBain, who is here at the conference, although I'm not sure whether she's free right now, to run our, isn't that freaking awesome? To run our Humanist Community project to help other communities around the country start centres just like that. And there's another benefit to community too. All of the social science research I've seen suggests that when people join congregational communities, they become more active in society. They volunteer more, they give more money and time, they become more politically engaged, they vote more often and things like that. And all those benefits are things our community desperately needs right now. So I think building congregations, building communities, will be vital to the future success of our movement. So to conclude, I don't want to annoy Scott by going over time. I can't imagine what he might do. Although I have some ideas. And some of them don't seem too bad in my mind. To conclude, I see two potential futures for the humanist and atheist movements in America. We can continue to do much the same of what we have been doing for so long and remain a feisty, prickly, fun, but ultimately inconsequential player in the American cultural scene. That's an option. Or we can unite around shared humanist values, begin to forge communities to spread our message, and in 50 years or so, and this is going to be a very long game we'll have to play, we might have as much impact on the public life of this country as the religious right has had in the last few decades. Now, to take that second route will certainly be extremely difficult. It will require hard work, discipline, and a hell of a lot of courage. But if the choice is between allowing the religious right to trample unchecked over minorities, women, immigrants, and the poor, or a humanist society which invests in science, education, and works for peace in the world, I know which choice I would rather make. There is an undeniable appeal, I admit, to playing the village atheist, thumbing our nose at religion, poking fun, and pulling faces. But we are capable of so much more, and our society demands so much more. The human species at this point faces a series of challenges unlike any in its history. The threat of climate change, the proliferation of nuclear weapons to unstable states, recently the returning spectre of chemical warfare, the enormous gap between the rich and poor, our endless consumption of consumer goods at a rate the planet cannot sustain for long. All problems which cry out for a strong humanist movement. If we are unwilling or unable to rise to these challenges, then who will? I believe if we pursue the path of unity and community, we could make a great difference to this troubled world of ours. So I'll end with a question. Who's with me?